Welcome to the second talk in this year's Contemporary History Institute speaker series. I have to say I'm delighted, and we're delighted, that today's speaker, Dr. Stephen Porter, has piqued your interest. And I'd also like to thank him for engaging with students and faculty earlier today at the Center for Law, Justice, and Culture, which was very interesting. Among other things, this yielded the insight that he's the nephew of the most recent past president of the Ohio University Board of Trustees. I have to check if that means by rule we don't get to pay you for family. Right. All right. My name's Ingo Trauschweitzer. I'm the director of the Contemporary History Institute. And for those of you who are new to our events, we're essentially a multidisciplinary outfit that links the perspectives of history, political science, economics, and journalism sort of formally, and then a few other departments in fields less formally in, among other things, a graduate certificate program. But we're interested in making sense of the questions that define our time, and by and large to do so from a historical perspective. And so today, those questions touch on the realms of U.S. foreign policy, refugee crises, and policies in the 20th century, and humanitarian impulses. And sadly, the topic and those themes, refugee crises in particular, remain at the forefront of the news in the 21st century. So we are very lucky that we have Dr. Stephen Porter here today from across the state. He teaches in the history department at the University of Cincinnati. Earned a bachelor's at Miami, though I suppose we can forgive that. Long time ago. It's past the statute of limitations. And went on to earn a PhD in history at the University of Chicago. He was also a fellow of the prestigious Institute for Historical Studies at the University of Texas. At Cincinnati, he serves, among other things, as director of the International Human Rights Certificate, and he's the author of Benevolent Empire, U.S. Power, Humanitarianism, and the World's Dispossessed, which appeared roughly a year ago with the University of Pennsylvania Press, and he's recently published chapters on humanitarian responses to World War II and on post-war diplomacy in edited volumes for Oxford and Cambridge. So I'm going to hand over the mic here in just a second. Before I do that, a couple of procedural points. With Dr. Porter's encouragement, we're going to go with a short break between the formal talk, which is about 50 minutes or so long, and the Q&A that follows, so that those who have other commitments can leave in peace and with a clear conscience, instead of the usual exercise of a stampede that gets louder as everyone tries to be quiet. Secondly, I'd like to point out that our next talk will be in 2 weeks. It'll feature Karen Greenberg, the director of the Center for National Security at Fordham Law School. And so with that, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Porter to Athens, to Ohio University, and to CHI.
Well, thank you, Ingo, as well as to the Contemporary History Institute and the Center for Law, Justice, and Culture, where I had a really enjoyable hour plus earlier today, and to some other folks probably in this room who have helped me, Connie Hunter, Stephen Miller, and for inviting me. I felt very warmly invited, and it's a thrill to be here. This is my first time actually ever on OU's campus somehow, and maybe that is because I got a BA many years ago from Miami, but it's not nearly as bad as they said. In fact, it's pretty nice, and I call her my Aunt Sandy. She's actually a cousin who was on the Board of Trustees here until recently, has always chastised me for not visiting, and told me today when I texted her that I was here, that it's the most beautiful campus on earth, and you better appreciate that. So on a day like today, that's quite easy actually to appreciate. So thank you for the warm welcome. And it's really nice to be here. In particular, as a historian, among other things, of U.S. foreign relations and international affairs more generally, it's a particular honor and thrill for me to be somewhere that has such a prestigious, venerable tradition right up to the present of the history of international affairs, international relations, in particular U.S. foreign relations, sort of dating back from quite some time up to the present. So that's a real honor. Thank you. So this talk, as should be clear, is sort of anchored around my book that came out actually a year ago to this month through the University of Pennsylvania Press, through the series on international human rights that they have. And so I will talk about it as a book, but obviously for those of you who are able to stick around for discussion afterwards, as should become clear from my talk, am eager to discuss sort of the issues both in the book and then those that are certainly attendant to it. So with that said, the United States has long reached out to aid some of the world's most vulnerable persons, but only in the 20th century, I believe, did the practice become an important way in which both the American state and civil society staked a claim for their country as a truly global power. The term benevolent empire emerged in the 19th century as a moniker for the explosion of Protestant missionary societies that spanned the continent and lands beyond to spread the gospel and often the purported benefits of American civilization. Now, by the early 20th century, sort of beginning of the period that I begin to deal with in this book, by the early 20th century, the enterprise had begun to morph into something less overtly sacred, more diversified in its participants, committed to the tenets of scientific charity and social work, and above all, tied to the project of promoting American authority, I argue, not just abroad, but at home too. Now, the phrase benevolent empire may have fallen out of favor by the time that armies of Americans committed themselves to unprecedentedly vast projects during humanitarian projects during the era of World War I. But the label still proved apt, I believe, albeit in altered ways, as the United States marched boldly through the new century. And now, when Americans now thought of themselves as part of an imperial venture, it was likely at least as much about country as God. And although 20th century America would never quite mirror European-style territorial empires, Americans often implicitly conceptualized their country's dramatic new extensions of global power through an imperial prism, I think, that partially but significantly justified America's influence over foreign populations by its benevolent intentions, that is, this is how it was understood, by its benevolent intentions for the most vulnerable and needy among them. Now, John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill had grown big, I think, and it refused to stay put in the 20th century. So Benevolent Empire interrogates this phenomenon by examining refugee aid initiatives and related responses to humanitarian crises led by American people and institutions from World War I through the 1960s. Now, these developments are an important window, I think, onto what has been called the short American century, when the United States rose to a position of a major world power and the American state and civil society profoundly retooled the way that they organized social life at home. Chronicling both international relief efforts and domestic resettlement programs aimed at dispossessed populations of foreign nationals, my study asks how, why, and with what effects American actors took responsibility for millions of victims of war, persecution, and political upheaval during these decades. It argues that the United States' ascendance to and maintenance of a position of elite global power was significantly justified and fueled by the proposition that the country's objects of philanthropic concern might potentially include any vulnerable persons across the globe. They didn't always, but the idea was that they might, that the U.S. had that kind of responsibility, so said these advocates. Now, Benevolent Empire is thus simultaneously, I think, a history of the United States and the world beyond, including embedding its narrative in several signal markers of the 20th century. And by that, I'm including in there massive human-made crises, organized efforts to assuage the effects of those crises, and the emergence of the United States as a major world power. So before diving more deeply into some of the particular parts of my book's narrative and related arguments, I think it's worth considering both what we already know from previous scholarship and popular conceptions about the 20th century history of U.S. refugee affairs, as well as some of the ways in which, at least I argue, my book advances or attempts to advance and I think sometimes challenges that conventional knowledge. So this is sort of the next few minutes is sort of why'd you do this project part of my talk. So first, there are several ways in which I think my book advances and sometimes challenges the conventional wisdom given both kind of through popular conceptions of refugee affairs and the history of them, and also from some of the scholarship that's out there. So first, for the most part, the traditional history of U.S. refugee affairs has thus far, I think, remained fairly marginal, actually, to our common understandings of both U.S. history broadly, as well as the history of the world, even more broadly than that. And this should strike us, I think, as Ingo suggests, this should strike us as odd. Since after all, we see refugee affairs all over the news today, right? Suggesting how they connect with a remarkable array of other contemporary issues, from immigration to national security to human rights to diplomacy to warfare to domestic politics to American and international law to education and welfare policies to international humanitarian aid to social relations involving race, ethnicity, citizenship, gender. And last but not least, to the United States' role in the world. Benevolent Empire seeks to present the wider history of such things that I believe so clearly animates our present moment, and unfortunately so, most of the time. So the second way in which Benevolent Empire, I think, challenges the traditional narrative concerns chronology. The traditional consensus holds that the United States had no official large-scale policy for refugees before the aftermath of the Second World War. Benevolent Empire, on the other hand, tries to move that chronology back a good ways, showing how critical foundations for post-World War II refugee policies were forged both with American-led overseas civilian aid during the First World War and with the largely overlooked admission and resettlement of many scores of thousands of Jews and other victims of Nazism during the 1930s and early 1940s. So it pushes the chronology back both for international war relief of a certain type as well as refugee admissions policies beyond what we typically consider for these. Now, the longer chronology that Benevolent Empire addresses from World War I through the 1960s also has the benefit of coinciding, I think, at the benefit anyway, coinciding with the period when the U.S. most vigorously rose to and maintained its position of a major world power, a project that I argue, again, was closely tied to American refugee and related humanitarian initiatives. So, third, the received story of U.S. refugee affairs has focused overwhelmingly on the domestic side of the equation. Benevolent Empire, however, tells a more complete story, I think, by showing how the tight integration between the domestic and the international dimensions of refugee matters had profound effects on both the United States and the world beyond, and I'll speak to that a bit more today. Fourth, the most influential scholarship on these topics has focused overwhelmingly on refugee admissions. So this kind of ties into the fact that I think that most of the scholarship and our knowledge therein is about the domestic side of the equation. But in addition to that, the scholarship is focused in particular on refugee admissions, on the politics of admissions, understandably so. Benevolent Empire, in ways that I'll elaborate on a little bit later, Benevolent Empire brings the organized resettlement of refugees into the frame, alongside admissions decisions to show not only what happened to refugees once they were in the country, but how admissions decisions were organically tied to the availability of adjustment support. So again, this is something I'll elaborate on later. And I also believe that this is something that is still true very centrally to U.S. refugee policies to this very day. Finally, the conventional story of U.S. refugee policies has focused also overwhelmingly on the action of the official state, whereas Benevolent Empire demonstrates how that history is dramatically incomplete and even skewed, I think, without understanding how both state and non-state actors work together, sometimes happily, sometimes not, in making refugee aid initiatives run. It is in these associational arrangements, or what I sometimes call hybrid or public-private arrangements, where so much of the often messy but important work of refugee assistance took place and, in fact, continues to take place to this day. The effects of this phenomenon can extend well beyond refugee affairs, something, for instance, that the book argues occurred during World War II, when the U.S. government in ways actually created a cluster of voluntary aid organizations, of nominally civil society private aid organizations created by the government, which would eventually, and I believe ironically, help form the core of what's been called the so-called non-governmental revolution in the later 20th century. Happy to talk about that during the Q&A if anybody's curious how that worked. So now that I've offered a broad overview of the book, I'd like to spend most of my remaining time sharing two separate snapshots from the book that give, I hope, a more textured sense of both the stories Benevolent Empire tells and the meanings that I hope those stories convey. These two snapshots illustrate the type of balance the book attempts to strike between exploring international aid on the one hand and domestic immigration and resettlement on the other. The first vignette addresses overseas war relief, with the second interrogating the country's first large-scale refugee program on U.S. soil. Okay, so in addition to that, it just seemed like a good time to tell a story, and I'm a historian, so we like to do that. Now, the first snapshot concerns a young man named James Becker, who graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Cornell as the United States entered the First World War in the spring of 1917. It's one example from the book that reveals the emergence and evolution of what I term people's philanthropic identities. Okay, their philanthropic identities towards especially vulnerable, faraway people, previously beyond many Americans' imaginative visions, if you will. In something I also work to do throughout the book, Becker's story lends to almost incomprehensibly vast, massive phenomena a more approachable scale, humanizing the complex choices and horrors confronted by thousands of Americans hoping to do some good in unusually challenging circumstances. Less directly, it additionally touches upon something that I address at much greater length in the book, and that is how a vast, complex, and sometimes dysfunctional field of state and non-state American humanitarian organizations could have a democratizing effect on Americans' outlets for expressing their various philanthropic identities and attendant senses of obligation. So this could be to their nation, government, their particular cultural group, or their wider conception of humanity. In the span of just several years, this James Becker embraced each of these types of empathetic sensibilities in simultaneously overlapping and evolving ways that deeply affected not only his life, but those of many thousands of civilian war victims that he and other during the war. And people like Becker, I guess I would say, that came of age in a sense during the devastating chaos of the Great War. And so too, I think, did the field of American-led international war relief that Becker helped to build. So, there he is. Raised comfortably in a Chicago household by a Jewish family that had emigrated from Germany decades before Becker's birth, the new college graduate wanted nothing more than to perform what he saw as his patriotic duty by following his well-bred Gentile classmates to Europe as part of an emerging American war effort. Forbidden to enlist by his parents, the disappointed college graduate's hopes were briefly lifted when he was later drafted, only then to face dejection once more when he was assigned to an office job. And the office job was with the War Department in Washington, D.C., rather than the battle trenches of Europe, where he really wanted to be. So when the war concluded at the end of 1918, Lieutenant Becker had missed his chance to serve his country by waging war, but an opportunity immediately presented itself to satiate his patriotic desires by ameliorating the human costs of war. And it was an indication, I think, of how thin the line could often be for people looking to contribute to either martial or humanitarian endeavors. Sort of a thin line often when this actually played out in reality, even though I think philosophically we tend to think of these things as separate, or legally even, these things as separate. By early the next year, the young lieutenant joined 2,500 other U.S. military personnel, conducting post-war relief work for the government-funded American Relief Administration, or what I'll refer to sometimes as the ARA, the American Relief Administration, directed by mining engineer and future U.S. President Herbert Hoover. Thousands more Americans were simultaneously fanning out across Europe and the Middle East to work for other humanitarian organizations during this time, organizations that boasted a spectrum of connections to both the U.S. government and America's vibrant civil society. These various institutional outlets invited these Americans to perform their diverse array of philanthropic identities on behalf of a devastated swath of humanity that included 20 million wounded civilians and soldiers, 10 million refugees, and countless more suffering from disease, starvation, and lawlessness. All of these folks left to the destroyed infrastructures, economies, and other mechanisms of social support. So for Americans seeking an outlet for their patriotic fervor and belief in international camaraderie, there were large entities like the American Red Cross and the aforementioned ARA, the American Relief Administration, all with their own close operational ties to the American state and symbolic association to the broad contours of the American nation. But Americans were also pulled into war along other, more particular registers of identification, often animated by their ethno-religious identities or affinities. They joined organizations like the YWCA, the Knights of Columbus, the American Friends Service Committee, and the Joint Distribution Committee, not only as good Americans, but also as good Protestants, Catholics, Quakers, Jews, French Americans, Polish Americans, and so on. Some negotiated what were often, in fact, overlapping philanthropic identities by migrating between the different agencies or even serving more than one at a time. Lieutenant Becker was initially thrilled to be part of the Great American Mission, as it was often called, not just because it allowed the young man to exercise his patriotic fervor by giving a battered world what he and his American colleagues believed the world needed to survive and rebuild itself in their country's image. The 24-year-old was additionally tickled just to be in the center of the action after the war. He loved the attention and even the adoration that he and other Americans received from local European populations. He was particularly thrilled by the adoration that he would get from women sometimes, as a result of the aid workers' connections to the ascending diplomatic, military, and economic heft of the United States of America. He enjoyed being in his uniform. As the young man encountered the less glamorous side of war relief in the coming months, however, he began an identity transition of sorts, from a patriotic U.S. Army officer helping a broadly conceived humanity in the name of his nation and its state, to an American Jew who came to see in the once foreign, battered Jews of Eastern Europe co-religionists to whom he owed a special responsibility. So I want to talk about this transition a little bit and what it means, I think. The change began slowly. Becker was initially assigned to conduct war relief in Poland, where dozens of pogroms would claim the lives of nearly 200,000 Jews during the late 1910s and early 1920s. After witnessing evidence of his first pogrom in the war-torn city of Lemberg, the young man from a Tony, Chicago neighborhood was unnerved, describing evidence of the unspeakable atrocities committed to the town's Jews as, quote, beyond belief. The newspaper descriptions that young Jim had heard growing up about such massacres in Eastern Europe's Jewish Pale of Settlement now seemed to Becker, quote, far too weak compared to the reality. And yet, when meeting with Jews from the area, the young military officer, Jim Becker, adopted the official posture of a U.S. government official addressing the humanitarian needs of everyone on a neutral basis, even if the reality he confronted indicated that some people, especially Jews in this case, suffered disproportionately more than others and were systematically denied a fair share of relief provisions from aid organizations. Becker's officiousness extended to lecturing the much older, often Jews of Lemberg with whom he met to join the Polish side of a war against Ukrainian nationalists. even though the town's Jews had learned through extensive experience, often tragic, that the Gentile combatants and civilians alike on either side of the conflict regularly found time for vicious anti-Semitic assaults. So for Becker, as for many of his fellow Americans, Gentile or Jew, conjuring such a sense of patriotism seemed natural. But the Eastern European Jews he lectured considered it quite a poor application, actually, to their particular predicament, as nationalism for them was perpetually used to exclude and oppress rather than unite and reward. This is sort of a different conception than what Becker had. Lieutenant Becker believed Polish officials to be, quote, right when they say that such a stand cannot exist, such a stand of not being involved in the war and committing, to, in this case, to the Polish side. Such a stand cannot exist, and therefore you are either with us or against us, either friend or enemy. Now, he was talking to people whose families and community had just been destroyed, right, by the very side, among others, that Becker was insisting they should go join. Becker continued, of course, and this was an American Jew saying this to other Jews. Becker continues, of course the pogroms were horrible and inexcusable, he reflected in his journal, but one can understand how they happened. The patriotic young army officer reasoned that, quote, if Poland was good enough to live in, it was good enough to die for. Now, as Becker was increasingly exposed to the horrific atrocities committed against the region's Jews in the coming months, though, he came to a different conclusion, lamenting that, quote, half of these countries are not worth fighting for, declaring Poland to be, quote, the land of hate and prejudice, where the very air is tainted. So the college student who in mid-1917 had begged for his parents' permission to fight for his country began 2 years later to scoff at the prospect of his country ever again raising, in his words, another army to save the world for democracy, he said sarcastically. So in the summer of 1919, Becker let his U.S. military commission expire, committing his labors instead and his skills to a new American relief organization that better suited his emerging empathetic sensibilities, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. As Becker worked with the Joint, as it was called, for the next year and a half, managing the distribution of food, medical care, orphanage support, and other forms of aid to suffering Jews of Europe, the overseas humanitarian project that once delighted the young man increasingly infused him with a sense of solemn responsibility for a particular group of people with whom he especially identified and whose plight seemed, to Becker at least, exceptionally profound. After a visit to arrange for the distribution of critically needed humanitarian supplies to war-torn Ukraine, quote, the heart of the worst pogrom territory, as Becker put it, Becker dropped his former policy of self-censorship when writing to his parents about the horrors he witnessed. Channeling whatever danger, and he may well have been the very first American humanitarian aid worker actually in Ukraine at this point. It certainly seems quite possible. It was a very dangerous, he went on his own and it was exceptionally dangerous for him to be there. But writing to his parents, I said, channeling whatever danger he sensed into sympathetic anguish and the rage of retribution, he told his parents of retreating troops making ritual cuts across the scalp of their victims, of the commonality of entire, quote, platoons of soldiers raping a single young girl or woman, of, quote, men and women and children who were thrown out of windows and cut to pieces, and of the, quote, special pastime of these devilish dogs in taking children by the feet and bashing out their brains against the wall. The young man who early the previous year delighted in sharing with his parents, and he had a lovely, sweet relationship with his parents according to all the stuff I've seen, the correspondence, the young man who delighted just a year before in sharing all the wonders of what he was up to with his parents, descriptions of stunning European food, architecture, and young women he encountered on his exciting overseas journey, admitted that, quote, the spirit of revenge is wide awake in me, and I should love to herd together the makers of these pogroms and boil them alive in hot oil. Though acknowledging that his parents, quote, probably shudder to read what I write, he explained that being in the midst of such things, it is only natural that I am aroused to the extent that you, from a distance, cannot comprehend. As Kitty and Abraham Becker read their son's report from the heart of the worst pogrom territory, it could not have escaped them how much he had changed since having predicted barely a year earlier that the opportunity to be part of the post-war rebuilding projects of Europe, quote, would be a wonderful education and would have a broadening influence on me. The latter had undoubtedly proven true, though the world had clearly lost some of its alluring wonder for their son. So I feel like among the various parallels between James Becker's early adult life and the field of American war relief that he helped to build, both were forced to grow up quickly. So the other snapshot that I'd like to share from the book occurred several years after the Second World War, just as the Cold War was ramping up. During 1949 and 1950, groups of sharecroppers in Mississippi sent letters to newspapers, families, friends, chronicling their extreme hardships living amid the cotton fields of the Delta. No matter how long and hard they labored, they complained, it proved impossible to free themselves of their debt to the plantation owners and the commissary stores. Picking cotton for endless hours, they often lived without decent food, shoes, furniture, or even roofs over their heads. Plantation managers sometimes beat them. "Where's justice?" one sharecropper asked. "Have we been punished by God?" Another lamented, "This is the life we live in an old Negro hut where water drips on our heads." Now, this particular letter writer described her abode as a Negro hut because she, and in fact the other letter writers, were political refugees from Latvia. And in fact, if you don't believe me, there we go. There we go. Here are some of their kids. And the plantation I'll talk about in a moment is this actually plantation here. And this is from New World Activity, from the photo press release of this. It was in some of the regional newspapers around. Says they are part of the Latvian children pick cotton none too expertly as their new home, at their new home near Senatobia, Mississippi. They are part of 21 displaced Latvian families brought to this country last month and now living on the farms owned by A.T. Callicott, Albert Callicott, who you'll hear me talk about in a moment, and his brother. So, how did they arrive in such seemingly improbable situation, moving from their Baltic homeland through the refugee camps of Germany and finally into the steamy cotton fields of Mississippi? Their plight, I argue, was certainly no mere accident. Rather, these Latvians had been brought to their sharecropper shacks through the U.S. Displaced Persons Program, America's first major immigration program aimed specifically at those persons deemed political refugees. As a result of congressional legislation, from late 1948 through 1952, 400,000 displaced Europeans, displaced from their homes by war, oppression, and regime change, were specially admitted and then into the United States, and then, and this is the key, systematically resettled into scores of communities across the country through the DP program. The planned resettlement component of the DP Act was applied to virtually all admitted refugees. It was new. It was officially a first for U.S. immigration law, though the book happens to show how guarantees of resettlement support from voluntary immigrant aid agencies during the earlier period of Nazi terror had been a less formal requirement for the admission of Jewish refugees. So I actually argue that this even begins in some ways even a bit before this. Now, in political terms, these displaced persons were not just any immigrants. The DP program was implemented on a world stage at a moment when both the U.S. government and the country's civil society institutions were beginning to define the content and the styles of America's new position of global leadership. At this formative moment of the Cold War, the DP program was heralded by its American supporters as powerful evidence to a watchful world that the merits of the American way of life vastly outweighed those of the Soviet system, from which most of the refugees had fled. It was, in the words of one U.S. official, part of America's, quote, strategy of freedom, a weapon in the country's arsenal of peace. And more recently, of course, we would call this type of thing soft power, right? So many thousands of displaced persons did indeed contribute to this strategy of freedom and arsenal of peace by quickly establishing comfortable, successful, fruitful lives in the United States as new Americans. But thousands of others, and in fact well beyond the Latvians of Mississippi, languished in various forms in the United States in ways that deeply confounded the desired message and then embarrassed the United States on a world stage, and finally made some American citizens and refugee newcomers alike question both the benevolence of the new American superpower's intentions and the efficacy of its means towards some of the world's most vulnerable people. So I'll talk about that a bit. So here are a few contours, in other words, of how this all came to pass. As the U.S. Congress considered a refugee admissions law in the aftermath of World War II, opponents of the law helped to add resettlement provisions to the law. So opponents wanted to add resettlement provisions to the law that both the opponents of the law and, in fact, the law's supporters believed would severely limit the pace at which refugees could enter under the law's time limit. It was a finite law. Various parts of these provisions pleased the refugee opponents and scared the heck out of the advocates for refugees. Two such provisions are relevant for our purposes here. First, a refugee had to have an American sponsor guarantee support for a prospective newcomer and that newcomer's family that included, among other things, job and housing, with neither displacing an American citizen. Okay? Second, this is particularly key, admitted refugees had to be distributed to various parts of the country, preventing them, the idea was, from concentrating in industrial cities and other areas where immigrants had been settling for many of the previous decades when given the chance. It required them to spread out, quote unquote, and to spread out to areas where most of refugees from Europe, Eastern Central Europe, in the past, for the past decades, had not been going. They'd been going to places like New York and Chicago and Philadelphia, right? So these things were put into the law by people who didn't want the law to work, okay? To make it clumsy, to acquire a job and housing and to spread them out to places they didn't want to go. That is, to have American sponsors in these places sponsor them, that refugees typically or other immigrants didn't want to go. And so, given an example of this here, the former Imperial Russian Army general in this photo, as one example, points to his future home of Des Moines, Iowa. Not somewhere like Chicago or New York, right? Where so many earlier Eastern Europeans had gone in the absence of the national resettlement system that shaped the post-war displaced persons program that I'm arguing was new in many ways. So the resettlement requirements in the new law produced a dilemma for refugee advocates, those in support of this law and of more refugees coming, just as they were designed to do. The law's distribution provisions demanded that a great many American sponsors would need to come forward from places like the American South and West and from rural areas all over the country. But these were the very areas where xenophobia, the fear of foreigners, ran the highest most often, right? Especially when it came to Jews and Catholics and others from Eastern Europe that in fact comprised the bulk of the 1 million refugees remaining in Germany, Austria, and Italy after the war. And this is after 10 million others had actually been returned home shortly after the war, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes forcibly, but that's another story and another book. But it turns out that both the proponents and the opponents of robust refugee admissions after the war through this displaced persons program, that both actually were proved wrong in their beliefs that the resettlement requirements would grind DP admissions to a halt for a lack of willing American sponsors emerging from areas generally opposed to immigration. They were both wrong. They were both surprised. So, on the contrary, and in a sign of how things would actually go, how the program would actually run, the second ship that sailed for the program contained 89 Latvians from Bremerhaven, Germany, sailing to Boston. Their new American employer had 2 private train cars waiting for them in the port of Boston, not far from the port, to whisk those 89 Latvians, those 21 families that you saw referenced a minute ago, to whisk them away to what one would later call their Negro huts. And it was on a 1,500-acre cotton plantation in Mississippi, near San Antonio. Their sponsoring employer was cotton plantation owner Albert Callicott. Now, 2 years prior, Callicott, this was in 1946, 2 years prior, Lieutenant Colonel Callicott, at the time, had been serving as the governor of the U.S.-occupied German city of Nuremberg. Now, as the Displaced Persons Act was being debated across the Atlantic 46 and 47 and part of 48, Callcott began eyeing groups of Latvian refugees whose industriousness and tiny, nice little garden plots had impressed him, that he saw both in the camps and just beyond the camps. And he began to think that these Latvians could be a solution to the labor shortages that he and other cotton planters back home had experienced, since many of the Delta's black sharecroppers and other laborers had escaped the oppressive region for wartime industry during World War II in American cities. They left. They finally got out, right? It's another story. Leaving folks like Callcott without enough workers. So before the refugees boarded their ship bound for the Delta's cotton fields, Callcott had them sign sharecropper agreements, if you know how sharecropping works, right? That bound the European refugees, like generations of African Americans before them, to an oppressive debt that most could never hope to escape through hard toil. Rock in a hard place. Now, in the coming months, and the months that followed, Callcott made similar arrangements, in fact, not just for himself, similar arrangements for his plantation-owning neighbors, with hundreds more Eastern European refugees arriving in the Delta over the next few years. Now, in this debt ledger here, if you can see it, I hope, for one such European sharecropper in Bremerhaven, heading to the cotton plantation of one of Callcott's neighbors in the Delta, you can see that not only did Callcott charge the other plantation owners a $30 recruitment fee. Right? You see this right up here. So Callcott charged this other cotton plantation owner a $30 sort of finding fee, if you will, for their new sharecroppers. And this was something that was officially, anyway, forbidden in the Displaced Persons Law. But that fee was immediately transferred from the new employer, right? Immediately transferred to the new sharecroppers, the new European sharecroppers, stifling debt. And this was all before the refugees set sail for the U.S. Right? They were put into a debt that was, for many, would be proved next to impossible to get out of, just as it had for black sharecroppers for generations before, since the end of the Civil War. Right? Now, such highly exploitative resettlement arrangements extended well beyond Callcott's scheme in the cotton fields of Mississippi to areas throughout the country, in fact. So, one example of that, obviously, this is an image attempting to sort of show the program in a more positive light, including these types of resettlements. Thousands of refugees were purposefully resettled throughout through the U.S. Displaced Persons programs to places like ranches in the Southwest, sugarcane marshes of Louisiana, fruit orchards in California, sugar beet fields in the Northern Plains and the Upper Midwest, and in fact, actually also as strike breakers in the industrial Northeast and beyond. So many of these newcomers worked in conditions of impoverished peonage or similar conditions that dramatically limited their ability to either lead comfortable lives or, in fact, leave the ones that they had. The plight in which these new Americans found themselves was, of course, not new, right? In the United States, anyway. But to the advocates of the U.S. Displaced Persons Program, these refugees were not guest worker migrants from Mexico or the Caribbean or racial minority citizens whose exploitation had long been the accepted norm. These refugees were marketed to American and world audiences alike as new Americans from Europe and future citizens and symbolic weapons in the budding Cold War. Their plight in European refugee camps had for many Americans been unacceptable politically amidst a burgeoning Cold War. But their misfortunes in the United States were proving similarly problematic, especially as news of the resettlements eventually hit newspapers across the world, from the U.S. military's Stars and Stripes to the Evening Moscow. Making matters worse, reports also emanated from the refugee camps abroad that members of Congress and large American employers had gained entry to displaced persons camps, sometimes inspecting the dexterity, muscles, other physical features of the prospective new Americans in scenes that one observer said resembled a, quote, slave auction. Albert Callcott and the many other employer sponsors of such refugee resettlements around the country carved out a critical space for them in the DP program, one that the architects of the law had certainly not envisioned. Most of these sponsoring employers had their resettlement arrangements approved and facilitated by the representatives of licensed, state-licensed American civil society organizations, and also the U.S. government that had originally been charged with managing the program. And these organizations were voluntary immigrant agencies, as well as a federal Displaced Persons Commission. That's how it was supposed to work. There was sort of a vetting procedure for employers first to go through these different organizations, state and or non-state, depending. Now, while the book explores more why these people and their affiliated institutions continued to support such resettlement arrangements, and they did, even after they sparked public controversy, caused a lot of problems on the floor of the UN, with the State Department, and beyond, I'm going to briefly mention several reasons here, just mention them. First, the alternatives for these refugees might have been worse. Although, to be fair to the historical record, they also might have been better. Second, the supporters of the refugee program had invested considerable political capital in the project. And to have the 4-year program end without the potentially allotted 400,000 refugees actually entering the United States might have been deemed an even greater failure. Finally, in terms of the reasons why these advocates continued to support this program and these types of resettlements even after they were publicized, finally, many of the champions of the country's first large-scale refugee program were influenced, and to me this is maybe the key point of all of them, many of the champions of this refugee policy were influenced by an ascending tenet of mid-century American liberalism. So what do I mean by that? Well, that is the concept of formal equality, When American and international critics complained of the refugees' problematic living and working arrangements, American refugee advocates often justified them by explaining that, and I think this is critical here, they justified them by saying there was no exploitation because there was no discrimination. Right? Formal equality, the concept of formal equality. In other words, the treatment of these new Americans was similar, they argued, to that of black sharecroppers, Mexican stoop laborers, and so on. Thus, the application of formal equality, in their estimation, justified the discrimination. But this logic revealed a vexing tension between the way that the United States was attempting to present its particular way of life to a watchful world in the early Cold War and a more complicated reality within American borders. The idealized trope of an America vigorously marketed to an early Cold War as the land of freedom, security, comfort, was said to rest considerably on burgeoning liberal norms of formal equality, of a growing commitment to policing discrimination. Right, sort of a prehistory to the civil rights movement, a nascent civil rights movement. But as the plight of European refugees recruited into bondage and to bonded peonage demonstrated, even the firm application of the principle of formal equality left ample room for substantive injustice. Okay? So, to conclude, what does the book suggest about the present state of U.S. refugee affairs, especially considering what a hot-button matter they have become, I think, unfortunately, in both American and international public discourse over the past couple years especially. And what does the book say about the broader intersection of humanitarianism, of U.S. foreign relations, and socio-political life in the U.S.? For the sake of time, I suggest that we can explore this during the discussion in a few moments if there's interest. But I want to briefly mention one issue in a moment and then say a bit more about another before concluding. So both of these points are elaborated, especially in the epilogue of the book, which contemplates certain aspects of U.S. refugee affairs from the 1970s to the very recent past. So the first one, which I'll just be brief about, my book demonstrates the often, and this is echoing something I've said before, my book demonstrates the often unrecognized fact that if there's one constant in U.S. refugee admissions policies over the past 75 years, and often people, when they talk about U.S. refugee policies, understandably talk about how inconsistent they are, right? We admit certain people in who are maybe less persecuted than others because of foreign policy. There's been a fair amount written on this, and it's correct so far as it goes. I have no or little beef with that. But what I would say is that, and what I argue in the book more, if there's one constant, actually, one thing we can put our finger on as to what are U.S. refugee policies, it's actually that in terms of the admissions of refugees, and goes back over 75 years, it's that the government decisions to admit some immigrants as refugees have typically been tied very closely to the guarantee, and I mentioned this at the beginning, to guarantee that admitted refugees would receive adequate institutional support after arrival, right? And so this fusion of admissions and resettlement that I argue for in the book, this fusion of admissions decisions and the availability of organized resettlement support has, I think, defined U.S. refugee policies far more consistently than the historically shifting political rationales for which refugees gained admission at one point in time and other assistance from the United States and which don't. Now, by not paying more attention, I think, in other words, to how refugees are treated once inside the U.S., and in fact how they adjust to their lives here, by not paying more attention to that, we forfeit, I think, various opportunities to better understand and improve, hopefully, the state of U.S. refugee affairs. I love this picture, by the way. The second point about how the history of U.S. refugee affairs might help us to better approach the present moments concerns the intersection of American empathy and American power, which my book is centrally concerned with, as is my teaching and broader research agenda. And this is a subject that I broached in the story, in particular, the story about Jim Becker of World War I. And it often comes as a surprise to many people that for a full decade after the end of the Cold War, so roughly through the 1990s, the refugees admitted to the United States continued to hail predominantly from the countries of America's former communist adversaries. A full decade after the Cold War was over, this was the case. So 3/4, in fact, hailed from either former Soviet sphere countries or Indochina, Vietnam, etc. Right? While relatively few refugees were admitted from other parts of the world, okay, through the 1990s, through the first decade after the Cold War. And a lot of these folks were actually, I think by most reasonable standards, left actually a lot more vulnerable by those refugees we were actually letting in. However, over the past 15 to 20 years, at least until the Trump presidency, perhaps, U.S. refugee policy has been steered more powerfully by, in fact, international norms, sort of more universal, somewhat more neutrally applied anyway, international norms than it had been in the past, over the past 15, 20 years or so, maybe a bit even more. U.S. immigration and security offices worked more closely with such international bodies as the UN Refugee Agency than they had previously, in other words. These changes produced a profoundly diversifying effect on the demographic composition of refugees resettling in the United States. Through much of the 2000s, refugees legally arriving in the United States regularly hailed from over 60 countries around the globe. Now, this was the case even with the dampening effect of that post 9/11, that post 9/11 security fears had on refugee admissions from predominantly Muslim countries. So such phenomena were fueled in no small measure, and this is key, by the rise of human rights politics, especially since the 1990s. A project that certainly went way beyond refugee affairs and that pushed the rights of individuals above the interests of either cultural groups or the interest of nation states, the sovereignty of nation states. And these developments have been welcomed, and quite understandably, and in my opinion, by many refugee advocates, right? This embrace of human rights and of sort of universal values and neutral values when thinking about how we want to treat refugees. Most importantly, they have served as a lifeline for many thousands of refugees. But I would like to suggest, and maybe perhaps somewhat controversially as I close, that these developments have come with a cost as well. Now, I don't claim to have an obvious way of avoiding the cost that I'm about to mention, but I do believe that better understanding how we got to this point can help us consider better ways to productively move forward. Though the climate of the Cold War has long prompted the United States to, in fact, ignore often the plight of the dispossessed when the perpetrators of that plight were not communist, Cold War politics specifically also served to mobilize critical degrees of support for refugees when further admissions were threatened. It's a bit of a conundrum. Even when the country's turmoil over the Vietnam War, for instance, even with that, hundreds of thousands of Indo-Chinese were still allowed entry to the U.S. rather than return to countries ruled by communist regimes. And as a telling counterpoint to this. From the first half of the 2010s, so recently, while camps overseas have swelled with refugees from devastation wrought in part by America's recent wars and other battles and conflicts, comparatively small numbers of, for instance, Iraqis, Afghanis, Syrians, have been welcomed to the United States, a phenomenon actually predating the Trump administration. And of course, the actions and rhetoric of President Trump have turned the environment for refugee admissions even colder, right? So while the jury is still out on how durable the anti-refugee policies of the Trump administration will be over the coming years, and if anybody's interested, I myself entertain a range of predictions. I don't see, depending on the day, I don't see the embrace by American refugee advocates of international human rights norms going away anytime soon. I think that's actually something that we can see is going to have some real residue, real sort of structural holding power. And so I suggest that it's worth still contemplating, and it's worth contemplating for the proponents of generous refugee policies, to ask what is both gained and lost by such an embrace of international human rights when considering deeper historical context. Some of them I've talked about today. So on the one hand, the geographical, racial, and religious diversity of refugee arrivals over the past couple decades, certainly until recently, but even still to some extent, speaks very well, I think, of modern American principles of democratic openness and cultural pluralism, right? A lot of this, again, is forged by the United States embracing international norms and embracing human rights politics in terms of who gets to come in, right? To take more account of actual persecution instead of the enemies of, which American enemies have persecuted versus American allies, right? So it speaks well of the United States in some ways. And on the other hand, however, most refugees in recent years have, and this is the downside, I think, have lacked the influential, broad and deep basis of support among American communities that ethnically European predecessors of today's refugees once boasted. Refugee communities in the early 21st century rarely benefit from similar solidarity by large and well-established American groups to help sustain them over both the short and the long terms, to bring them in and also to care for them here. The political climate and demographics that have commonly informed American refugee affairs in recent decades and even recent months thus seem to have, somewhat ironically, I think, diluted the depth of advocacy that earlier generations of refugees often enjoyed. And champions of international human rights, and I often consider myself one of these, I think that these are sober realities that we have to think about deeply. And again, I don't know if I have the answer to it, but it's something worth thinking about and understanding and acknowledging. So this observation, I think, in other words, should alarm refugee advocates by trying to determine how to challenge the goals of the current U.S. presidential administration in particular. But, alarms can be useful, right? So finally, and I should say, to be clear here, I am certainly not suggesting that America's concern for the dispossessed should somehow return to periods when geopolitical and domestic political culture meant that the overwhelming proportion of persons the country assisted suffered only at the hands of America's enemies, and until the Indo-Chinese refugee program after the Vietnam War boasted predominantly or almost only European ancestry. I am not suggesting we return to those days. Rather, the history of those developments, for all its problems, shows that America's interests were frequently best served when the country tapped into its genuinely benevolent impulses on behalf of the world's tired, poor, huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, right? If the American people still want to justify their country's enormous authority around the globe, at least partially through a claim that they are genuinely interested in improving the lot of the world's most vulnerable, then they might do well to deepen their feelings of solidarity even as they broaden them. And that's all I have. Thank you.
All right, we'll take a 35-second break, sort of a seventh inning stretch, and then go back with the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to moderate the?
I'm happy to do that. Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. That works. Yeah, sure. That's fine. That's fine. Sure.
I am, yes. Okay. Okay. Please do so. I don't know if I remember. Okay. All right. Well, you know when I am. Send me an email. I'm sending the syllabus. All right.
Photography. All right.
Okay.
Questions?
First question. These people coming in, the refugees from other places, were they on a fast track to citizenship, or did they go through a long process before they were declared citizens?
Sure. So the question is, did Eddie? He mentions particularly the. So I'll respond to this particularly as the post-World War II refugee program, the Latvians, the Poles, and others who came in as part of the Displaced Persons Act. Were they put on a fast track to citizenship, or were there sort of bureaucratic hurdles like there were for other folks? They actually were not put on a fast track to it. It was a 5-year program eventually, and they were able to. So effectively, after they got here, legally speaking, they more or less sort of transformed into regular permanent resident aliens, right? We call today PRAs, and were put on a regular path to citizenship, right? The distinction that I argue is this resettlement sort of nexus of how they had to come into the country, right? What had to be there in order for them to be admitted, and then once they got here, these resettlement arrangements that they were saddled with. And for some, these resettlement arrangements, I happen not to talk about them today, but for some, these resettlement arrangements were in fact a godsend. Gave people jobs in factories in Philadelphia, or as farmers in Wisconsin or Minnesota or something, on a dairy farm. But to answer your question in these particular, now I won't go on about this much, but depending on the program, the U.S. refugee policy was as such. It was, in terms of the admissions, it was ad hoc, crisis by crisis programs until 1980. At which point the country had its very first refugee law. There was some provision for refugee admissions yearly in the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, the Hart-Celler Act. But for the most part, it was sort of ad hoc, crisis-driven refugee policies during the Cold War, for the most part. And so for each one, they were different. And so there were times when the Cubans were hung out to dry and had no path to citizenship, but then that gets, through lobbying efforts and so forth. So it was never really crystal clear. And once the 1980 Act passed, in fact, that whole thing was rationalized again so that refugees, for the most part, were in fact put on a regular path to citizenship. The distinction, again, I argue, being not just the rationale for why they came in, but this sort of organized public-private resettlement regime, if you will, that they kind of fell into that had all kinds of I think, fairly significant effects on things.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, I was interested in Mr. Becker.
Yeah.
A couple of questions. How did he communicate? I'm sure he didn't speak Yiddish, and the people he was dealing with.
You're right.
So the question number one was,
Well,
how did he communicate?
Yeah.
Secondly, did he become a Zionist as a result of this?
Yeah, really good question. He became a, to answer the second question last, I'm trying to articulate this properly. He became a rather soft supporter of, certainly a supporter of the state of Israel, but a soft Zionist, maybe, if you will. He was sort of linked into some well-known folks who were hardline Zionists and never quite saw eye to eye with them on that. But that said, he would say things. I'll stand actually out here. Everyone hear me okay? This said, Jim Becker would oh, sorry. Go back to my microphone and behave. Okay. This said, Jim Becker would write back to his parents and say things like, Rabbi, and I forget the name of the person, at the Reform Synagogue at Temple Sinai in Chicago, the main Reform Synagogue, and a fair number of pretty prominent mostly Germanic Jews in Chicago went there, but he'd say, Rabbi so-and-so trained me really lackadaisically, didn't they, Mom and Dad? We're gonna have to fix this when I get home. Dad, his father was quite wealthy, actually, a big financier, actually quite wealthy. Dad, for all these charities that you support in Chicago, in the Jewish neighborhoods of Chicago, where folks are from Eastern Europe in this case, and Orthodox typically, why do we not always offer them truly kosher meals, right? And things like this. I mean, it really started to bug him. So he did become much more religiously observant and I guess conservative, with a capital C in that sense, when he came back. It had a profound impact on him. Yeah.
And communication.
Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you? What was that part? Oh, yeah. So he actually had picked up a little bit of Yiddish because his dad did run all of these different charities. In Chicago, but not much. He spoke good German. He was stationed a lot of times when he wasn't kind of out in the field. He was in Paris, and he spoke horrible French, but that wasn't really his refugee work. He would brag to his parents about how the young women loved his uniform, as I referenced earlier. They call it trait, and this is from his journal. They call it très chic, but he wasn't always great with English either. He was fine with English, but his spelling was off. He'd spell it C-H-I-C-K, très chic. But he talked a lot of times about how he bungled with that. But he got by often with German, and when he couldn't, he'd do what he could. Yeah, he was a small guy. The speculation has been that I can tell among people who were friends with him then, from what I've seen from primary sources, is that he was either kept out of the military because his dad pulled some strings, I think is plausible, or, and it could have been both, that he was too slight of build. He was a tiny guy, and his wife later talked about how he would do push-ups constantly, apparently. He would tell her this later, to try to bulk up so that he would actually join, but nevertheless. But he was a bold fellow. He was a small guy, but he kind of went into danger and really didn't seem to worry about it. And I don't mean to be speaking about that so hagiographically, right? Because there are things in this chapter, as I referenced some today, that I think it's easy to be critical of him at times, but it really is a coming of age story that I found fairly fascinating. Yeah. So, sure. Yes?
I find it interesting, the comparison between the reception of refugees in the early Cold War period and today's attitudes towards refugees from war-torn areas that the United States has been, extending our military, foreign policy, et cetera. How do you, in your opinion, what reason, why were people that were traditionally, in like Middle America, traditionally had been more skeptical of refugees, more open to a guy from Russia coming to Iowa, for example?
Yeah.
Was it part of the national rhetoric that was separating communists from those areas?
Yeah.
Versus just ordinary Russians, or what was it?
Yes. There's another issue too. In fact, there's half issue in addition, which I'll explain in a second, beyond the Cold War, and another issue that's a little bit more social cultural, if you will. So I'll address the first one first, and hopefully not forget about the second one. Let me know if I do. The Displaced Persons Act was envisioned right after World War II, so like 1946, right, as part of this sort of larger suite of United States humanitarian aid initiatives and development initiatives and the like, right? And so even I'm including here like the rebuilding of Germany and Japan and the Marshall Plan, but as well as what we might think of as sort of more traditional humanitarian efforts through the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which actually emerged during the war and was replaced by an international refugee organization called the International Refugee Organization a little bit after the war. Anyway, this needs to be understood within a broader context. And so in a sense, it wasn't just Cold War political or geopolitical rationales, if you will, although it was significantly that. But when the Displaced Persons Act was first conceived and began to make its way through Congress, it was, if you will, it was sort of a little bit of a different political moment that was kind of at its we now know in its last throes, which was World War I America, global leader, as it wanted to be anyway, the Allies. Sort of political imperatives, right? That the United States, in other words, has a responsibility to quote unquote do its fair share coming out of the war, right? And that sort of morphs, that meshes, right? That intersects with what we now know as an emerging Cold War over 46, especially 47 and 48, so that by the time this particular act finally got passed, the United States was most definitely in a Cold War, right? And the Soviet Union was most definitely not an ally anymore, and in the Soviet sphere more generally, right? So that's one. Yeah, that certainly that had a lot of sway, as it would continue to have sway over the course of the Cold War, taking a dip, I would say, after sort of the Vietnam and Watergate era, but especially Vietnam era, as sort of Cold War imperatives lost some of their luster, at least for a while, and among some, I think, in the United States through the end of the Cold War. So the other issue is that, I think that even though there were plenty of folks in this country in places that I talk about, Mississippi, Louisiana, and so on, Arkansas, Deep South, also parts of the West, who were suspicious of Eastern and Central, sometimes Central Europeans, Catholics and Jews, and maybe Coptic Christians even, coming into this country. This is a complicated issue, but I think, and I don't mean to dehistoricize race, but I think the fact that they were all perceived as white Europeans, right, even if not, as some would say, as white as others right away, right? This is a time when that was sort of different degrees of whiteness, if some have suggested, it had begun to flatten and would continue to flatten certainly at this moment. That mattered, It mattered also that they were perceived as different than say, Baptists and Lutherans in Senatobia, Mississippi, or wherever. But nevertheless, they were perceived, there was sort of a presumed shared common racial identity that, for instance, with these folks in Mississippi, let's say, and Louisiana, the advocates, the plantation-owning advocates, or the sugar company advocates for these folks coming and working there, and in my mind certainly being rather exploited at times fairly significantly, were harder workers, right? Sometimes they would be called, right? Harder workers than the workers we had, than our Negro workers before, right? They understand things. So I think that matters, even though it's not quite as easy, and when I talk about this case study, for instance, to my undergraduates, in a research sem or something like that, I always pause on this to make sure they're not misunderstanding that white is white at any given moment, right? So I'm certainly not suggesting that, but I do think it matters, and that's a difference than what we have today. And another way of putting it is that you don't have mirrored or paralleled communities with the same majority status and relationship to power that I think you had during a lot of the periods I'm talking about, especially during the Cold War. And by that I mean that most of the groups that need to come into, that many think need to come into the United States now, if one believes that we should make room for the particularly vulnerable and persecuted, many of these groups do not have communities with significant amounts of power and authority, or size often. And that is one of the things that I was suggesting is rather vexing about the diversification of refugees coming into the United States from places like Sub-Saharan Africa, the Maghreb, Middle East, the Caucasus areas, certain places in Asia, and the like. All right. So, yes.
Yeah, so I was wondering about the evolution of the public-private partnerships. If there had been any change, sort of in the structure of those and the funding of those. I mean, I ask in part because I've heard on panels people who are sort of currently working in refugee resettlement
Right.
states and stuff. It seemed like at least the current system of how they work with the government on refugee resettlement leaves them quite vulnerable, and in terms of, yes, exactly.
Yeah,
right?
money.
And so if there's a holdup, as maybe in the current administration, and there's this moment of uncertainty, they were told they were going to be able to resettle people, but then there's a stop, then the money stops.
And it's per capita as to how they get their money. So
and
just
then you have to let staff go.
Right.
And so you were talking about what are
Right.
the long-term implications.
Right,
for
right.
this. I'm wondering how much that would gut sort of the actual process of refugee resettlement. So I was wondering if that is sort of a common thread, or that.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I deal with this a fair amount in the book, but it's in some other places too. But it's a real conundrum today. Again, because the money is attached to the number of refugees coming in these days per capita. So again, think about what that means if all of a sudden an organization in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, my home city, suddenly is allowed to resettle 40% fewer refugees than it had been before. Well, they're operating on a shoestring budget already, right? There's not much give there. As you say, they need to lay people off, and those people may not just be there hanging around to come back. These people with institutional knowledge and skills and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? They have to move into different offices. So there'll be some real structural constraints when, and I believe it will, when this picks up at some point in the future. It's going to be real growing pains. So the question of kind of historicizing this, in short, what I call the voluntary agencies are licensed. There's roughly a dozen of them, more or less, that are licensed, a little less, to resettle folks across the country. And I'm talking like umbrella agencies, right? Obviously, as some of you, I'm sure, know in here, these things are then localized. There's local organizations, churches, synagogues, mosques, whatever, secular organizations, right? Mayor's offices. But the umbrella organizations are licensed by the federal government, State Department, Health and Human Services, and so on. And these days, the relationship again it's fiscal, it's financial, right? And the voluntary agencies are what I call a big part of their relationship is they are effectively subcontractors of the state with a financial relationship as well as a legal relationship to the state. That's something that actually began to emerge, and rather dramatically so, with the Cuban refugee crisis beginning in the late 50s, with Castro coming to power, and in terms of large numbers of refugees coming here began really in the early 60s. And let me give you the real quick and dirty story, very quick and dirty story of that, which is suddenly, southern tip of Florida, mostly Miami, right, Dade County, has this huge influx of scores of thousands, often, of folks coming across, in boats and eventually planes too, into this one small area. Public officials in Miami at the county level, Dade County, and of course the state of Florida begin screaming about this. Understandably, how are we supposed to support this, right? This Miami ballooned in population, and a lot of these folks, even though the first numbers of them came over with some wealth, right, but increasingly, pretty quickly, they didn't. Or as much education or transferable skills and the like. And so eventually, this also coincided with the Kennedy administration coming into power in early '61, right? Kennedy administration, unlike the Eisenhower administration that gave $1 million to one of Ike's buddies, Tracy Voorhees, and said, go fix this. The Kennedy administration kind of funneled it all through federal channels, through health, education, and welfare, now today's HHS. And it brought formalized the relationship between the voluntary agencies and the federal government, and made that relationship again one of subcontractor status of the voluntary agencies more officially than it had been before, where money was given to them on a basis that would sort of evolve, but that their livelihood became tied to the state. What did it look like before? Different. You had the voluntary agency still there. You had a lot of people who were involved in these things because they really cared about it, and that's true to this very day, of course. A lot of these groups were tied to different religious organizations, even if they were basically secular while still being sectarian, not all. But nevertheless, and sometimes they'd get a little bit of support from the federal government, but often that support was more in administration and governments and sort of partnering in other ways, and they raised their money for the most part other ways. Now, why? Because politically it was untenable, especially once the Cold War ramped up. And I would argue even before that, if you look at the 1930s, it was untenable for these private organizations who were helping these refugees to resettle to get government funds or to put their refugees on federal money during the New Deal, during the Great Depression, because they were Jews and they were foreigners. And the folks running these things, both in government and out of government, who were sympathetic to the relatively small but not insignificant number, about 250,000 of Jews who managed to find haven here in the U.S., whether overstaying visas or coming in during the 30s through early 40s. The folks who were sympathetic with them being here knew that if There was publicity about these people getting federal money, whether channeled through a voluntary agency, a Jewish agency in this case, or receiving New Deal aid on their own, even when legally entitled to it. And a lot of FDR's programs actually allowed aliens to receive certain forms of public relief, that all hell would break loose politically, and that the whole thing would be, that was their estimation, that was their calculation. I happen to believe it was true, but that was also the so anyway, so there was a very different relationship between the federal government. There was a whole lot of cooperation and sometimes battling between them, but it was very different than what would emerge from the 60s and onward. So once then you had the Vietnamese, et cetera, refugee flow of the mid-70s and beyond, and on up to the present day. That relationship of kind of a subcontractor status of the VOLAGs, as they call them, voluntary agencies, on a financial basis, continued. And again, making, on the one hand, these organizations have been getting money from the federal government, which is what a lot of them wanted before and weren't able to do as much as they could before, right? Really wanted that federal money. It allowed them to do a lot. On the other hand, they're beholden to the whims of changing political circumstances, yes. Yes, and then, sorry, I'll get you next time. Yes.
Earlier in your talk, like right before you started talking about James Becker, you had alluded to, and you had asked us to ask about how government-made non-state programs kind of fueled anti-government revolution later in the century.
This was World War II I talked about. Yeah, okay, thanks for bringing that up. This relates to this point, in fact, in some ways. Quick and dirty story on that. I'll try to be quicker, even. The beginning of World War II, even before the United States became involved as a belligerent in December of 41, so beginning in 39, hundreds of sometimes mom and pop shop voluntary organizations, charities, popped up all over the country to help this group or that. Right? A whole bunch of them were for the people of England, right? But a whole bunch of them weren't. And among other things, there was fraud in some of these, just as you'll see today. Hurricane relief, you'll hear about fraudulent organizations, I'm trying to make money off of this kind of thing, and everything's moving so quickly, and it's a moment of crisis, so it's hard to police. So this was happening during this period. And so some thought, including within FDR's administration, Secretary of State at this point, that something should happen in terms of these organizations being regulated. There were also people among the organizations themselves that thought we are being terribly inefficient with this. And then there are those who believe, and I think this is true too, that the federal government actually was rather nervous, especially when the U.S. got into the war and charitable giving and organizations increased even more, that at a time of perceived profound resource scarcity for the perceived needs of this all-out war, that there was this huge voluntary sector that folks were giving money to that the federal government didn't really have any control over, or not much. So long and short of it is that FDR began to appoint some committees to with increasing levels of legal authority to regulate these war relief agencies who were operating abroad in this case, right? So this isn't an immigration story. This is actually war relief abroad. And the federal government basically, through what I call a spurt of, evolutionary Darwinism, right? Sort of forced consolidations and closures of hundreds of these war charities, closed them. Required, for instance, and sometimes it was rather painful and controversial as to what the government was telling these charities to do. And so a group like, Americans for Free France were required to consolidate with another one supporting Vichy, France. You can imagine. You had similar problems with Yugoslavia, the provinces there. Different groups supporting different conceptions of Palestine and the like, and so it got ugly. Different political factions for Italy were forced to consolidate. And so after the war, a little bit after the war, so the federal government, in other words, kind of created a degree of regulation of American civil society, in this case of the charitable wing for war relief agencies, that was actually really profound. Federal agents would go into charities' offices, demand to look at their ledgers, or sometimes break in with warrants and look at their ledgers, and if they felt that they were operating too inefficiently, even if it wasn't fraudulent, they'd close them down. You imagine the people who ran these things, were sort of in their minds giving their livelihoods and their time and their sweat, the blood, sweat, tears, not so happy with it. So after the war, some of the legal authority that the federal government had over this sector of the American civil society, this philanthropic sector, was withdrawn a little bit. But again, as the Cold War ramped up, and the federal government sort of its presence abroad ballooned, right, during the Cold War in different ways, including for development projects, other kinds of aid projects. Even though these agencies, these voluntary agencies, were not required to the same extent to kind of go by federal guidelines to exist, if they wanted to play ball with the increasingly large federal government overseas in the operations that they wanted to perform, they had to play by certain rules. So they stayed and remain in many ways under a particular form of federal yoke, and I don't mean that to suggest that in some nefarious way, although some might. One quick other thing that it did is the irony is that many of these voluntary agencies' leaders and personnel were really ticked off about this, but it also somewhat ironically created a much more efficient, streamlined, and professionalized and rationalized overseas active philanthropic sector. Because it trimmed the number of organizations. It did actually require them to kind of operate in a more efficient way. And the federal government was looking for international partners in overseas relief, especially cleanup, if you will, after the war, that many federal government officials believed was critical for geopolitical reasons, right, for American national imperatives. And many of these organizations, final thing I'll say about it, is that some of these organizations really did, if you trace the organizational genealogy, become some of the core kind of humanitarian-oriented, what we now call non-governmental organizations of the, if you will, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and up to today. And what I find somewhat ironic is having sort of discovered this particular history is that NGO sector, which often embraces, again, international humanitarian norms, these days international humanitarian rights, it embraces these things often as a way of suggesting we are speaking truth to power, and that power is usually in the form of states. Right? Maybe none more powerful than the United States, that the U.S. government actually created really important sort of seeds for that NGO revolution. So that's something else that I'm going to write about. Can I ask one more? And I'm sorry, you've had your hand up for a while.
I can ask it later. I was going to say maybe one more question.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
So, you speak of Southeast Asia, and my parents came over as refugees, and we were sponsored by a church, and I remember, and I don't know if in your book or in your research you delve into the role of church and government, if there's any maybe expectations that the government has of these churches. And I remember just talking to people in the refugee community, thinking, some of them would say, we felt like these churches expected us to join their church all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And that was kind of contingent on, and because of that, they either got more support from churches or didn't. And so I wonder, maybe that was from the government, or was that more?
Well, the government certainly didn't orchestrate that. The basic rule, and this actually goes back all the way to even to Herbert Hoover and World War I international relief, but certainly this displaced persons program that I mentioned after World War II. The general rule most of the time with the government was that if you want to be licensed by the federal government and to be able to do many of these things, you umbrella organizations that I talked about earlier, you national voluntary agencies that maybe are affiliated with pan-Protestantism, or there's a separate group for Lutherans or Catholics and so on, or Jews, that you can't be proselytizing in your mission. You have to separate out, if you have a proselytizing wing, which many did, you have to separate that out organizationally, legally, kind of a wall, right? Glass-Steagall kind of thing, from the rest of it. But of course, as your experience suggests, when you actually talk about the local organizations that are affiliated with these different national groups, that's not how it often worked. And in fact, there weren't really laws then, because these are the sponsoring organizations, and so that happened a lot of times. So typically there wasn't much federal interference, nor as I saw was there a promotion of it, at least as I've seen, but there certainly wasn't interference with it. So, yeah. And this will often, could be less of a problem before the Indochinese refugee program beginning in the mid-'70s, because the large majority of refugees coming to the United States were either Jews or Christians of different sorts, and there were organizations already, or at least emerged or were already in place, old immigrant aid societies and the like, right? As well as local churches and synagogues to take them. Now, when folks started coming in from Southeast Asia, some came over as Catholics, of course, but many didn't. And this sort of has continued on to the present day of trying to work that out. So.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you all.